Hello, and welcome to the Thinking Jew podcast, where we dive deep into Torah and Judaism to uncover its hidden beauty. Come join us as we take a closer look and breathe new life into traditional Jewish ideas. And now, here's your host, Rabbi Moshe Siegel.
Hello, and welcome to episode 40. In today's episode, I'm going to take a slightly different path than I normally take, and rather than going through one concept, I want to share with you a bunch of stories that have happened to me mostly over the past month or two in building the eruv here in Richardson, and I just felt such an obvious hand of God guiding us and helping us along the way that it was a tremendous inspiration to me, and I wanted to share that with you as well. There's a well-known philosophy in Judaism, which is that when you do something for the tzibur, when you do something for the group, for the community at large, there's always a special siyata d'shmaya, a special assistance from heaven that when you take care of God's children, God helps you in that sense. And that was something that I felt so strongly over these past few months, so I just wanted to share some of them with you. So in order to have an eruv be kosher, the enclosed area, this eruv district, has to be 100% enclosed on all sides. And you can imagine in a city landscape, it's somewhat difficult because there's always some gaps. There's somebody who doesn't have a fence up in their backyard, or there's a gap between a utility pole and a municipal wall or a fence or any of these gaps, and you have to get them down to a very small size in halacha, in Torah law, in order to make it work. So there were multiple people whose houses we had to go knock on their door and ask them for permission, in most cases, to hang up a string either across from two trees or from their fence, and it didn't actually, impact them in any real way or interfere with their usage of the area, but it was kind of a pretty random request from somebody outside to knock on your door and ask them. So initially, we were somewhat, hesitant trying to figure out how exactly these conversations would go. You're going to knock on the door of a random not Jewish person who's never heard of an eruv before and start literally at square one, hoping at the end to get permission to hang strings on their property. But then we started knocking on some of these doors and having these conversations with people, and you saw Hashem in these conversations with you. Every single person was so nice and so kind, so open and helpful. Obviously, we had to work through the conversation until they understood exactly, where we were coming from, what is an eruv, why is this important. The whole conversation in each house was a lot of time invested, but the people responded in such an unbelievably positive way. There was really only one house that we had a little bit of, tension with, and that was just because he had so many trespassers that used to go through his property, and he thought that when we were talking about his backyard that we wanted to create a pathway go through there also, which was a trigger for him. But as soon as we were able to explain to him and really have the conversation of what we wanted, he actually became a tremendous ally because his area where there's no fence in his backyard, he's like, I actually always wanted a fence there, and we're actually hopefully going to split that fence with him, which would be an amazing win-win for both of us. He'll be able to keep trespassers out. We'll be able to continue that fence of our eruv. But in the meanwhile, he also gave us permission to hang up the wires we need in order to get those across. So literally every single person was so kind to us. So here's a great story. There was one house, then we got permission from her to hang a string across her fence. And in order to do that, we have to make these strings high enough that they're not going to at all be in the way of anybody that's, walking around through the backyard over there. So we had the fence was a 6-foot fence. So we had to put a post next to the fence to make the string much higher up. So we had two options of doing that. We could either put in like a metal fence post and just attach that up much higher, like a 12-foot one, or we could take a piece of wood and attach the wood to the end of her fence. She was totally fine with us doing either one of them. So the wood would look much nicer and be much better. The problem is you have to match the wood to the stain. She recently redid her fence, and it's just much more involved to do that than to just buy a metal post and put it up. So we went back to our house to check which one, if we really needed to do the metal or if we could have gotten away with the wood. And Rabbi Honingsfeld and Rabbi Ribia were the ones that went to her house. And when they get there, they see that her neighbor right across the alley is actually installing a new fence. And not only that, but the fence that they were installing was the exact same color stain that the house we needed was using. So Rabbi Honigsfeld goes over to the person building the fence and explains to him that we need a piece of wood in this exact color for this fence across the alley. Are we able to perhaps buy a piece of wood off of him since he already stained it? The guy looks at him and responds, "Don't worry about it, no need. I always prepare extra wood just in case something gets messed up on the fence, something goes wrong, and I'm already done here. I have a lot of extra wood. No problem. Here, take 2 pieces, and don't worry about paying me. I'm happy to help you on your project." Amazing. What are the odds? The neighbor across the alley is renovating her fence at the exact same time we need, and she's doing the exact same color we need, and at the time that we went there, the fence guy was there with extra wood and willingly donates it so that we could put it up and match her fence perfectly and build a beautiful Tzuras Pesach for her. Amazing. Another story, during part of the construction process, so I had to walk around with a representative of Encore, which is the utility company, and we were discussing certain utility poles, whether or not we could do the proposed work on them or not. Every single pole has so many details to it that the layman would have no clue which kind of work you could do on which pole without having one of their expert engineers with you. So I'm walking around with this guy, and one of them is on a property that belongs to a guy, we'll call him Mike. And when Mike sees Encore show up, he gets nervous and he runs out because this pole is located on his property. And in the past, Encore has done work there and they've damaged his lawn and his garden and he's gotten upset. And it just so happens that this is one of the properties that there was a gap on as well. And we would need to talk to him about potentially putting up a Tzuras Pesach, which is a halachic door frame, to close that gap as well. And I was very nervous to go talk to him as he was a little rough the first time we met him with Encore. So Rabbi Honigsfeld and myself are on the golf course, which borders his backyard. It's off of his property, but right behind it. And we're checking out a fence there to see if we could use that fence for the eruv. And as we're probably like 2 or 3 doors down from him on the golf course side of it, he comes out of his house and wants to know what we're doing looking at the fence back there. So it kind of forces us into a conversation with him, and we end up having this whole discussion explaining it to him. And he tells us he's actually from a town in New Jersey that was 60% Jewish, and he says, quote, "If I didn't like Jews, I wouldn't have had any friends." He then tells us he's happy to help with anything that needs to be done, and he actually himself ended up installing 2 Tzuras HaPesachs, 2 halachic door frames, even buying the materials and doing it himself, which is pretty incredible. We'll come back to him in a second, but another story is there's this property on the northern border. It's a massive property, and it has at the back of it, which is actually the back end of our eruv, a barbed wire fence. But since that part of the property has not been well kept, it was knocked down in a lot of places by trees and bushes and stuff, so the fence wasn't standing properly, and we needed to fix that up in order to make it count as a Jewish legal wall. So the problem was we weren't really able to access the houses because there was this massive property, and the houses were down this private road with like this gate in front, and so we weren't really able to speak with the owners. This was really the last piece of the eruv puzzle, was this property and the property next door to it, which shared this private road. We needed access in order to build on that second property a Tzuras HaPesach, and on the first property to fix his fence. So let's go back for 1 minute now to our friend Mike from the last story. So we had one part left to do on his property, and I made up with him that we'll come Sunday morning to go do that. When we get to his house Sunday morning, his wife tells me he just ran out to the store. You missed him by a minute. He'll be back in 15 minutes. So I was there with Rabbi Ribiat, who came in from Baltimore to help us, and not wanting to waste time, Rabbi Ribiat was leaving later that day, we went to go check out a different part of the area that we still needed to work on, and we told his wife to tell him that we'll be back in about a half an hour to finish up. As we're driving to this other place, I notice, as we're driving by that large estate property, that someone's mowing the lawn on the street side of that property. And I figured it's probably a landscaper, not the owner, but let me go see who it is so I can at least get some access and try to talk to the owner of the property. Pull over, run out of the car over to this guy. He shuts off his lawnmower for a second, and I have the opportunity to talk to him. It actually was the owner himself. Super, super nice guy. He's actually owned that property, was in his family since the 1800s. And the street that it's located on is actually named after his great-great-grandfather. If anyone from Dallas is listening to this, his last name was Campbell. And he was extremely happy to let us fix his barbed wire fence and back, wherever he wanted to adjust on it, touch it. Sure, full permission. And he said, actually, the property next door is owned by his cousin. And he gave me his phone number and said, I'm sure he wouldn't mind either. Eventually, I made it over to him as well, and he was super nice and let us do things in his back of his property as well. So had Mike been home, I never would have been able to find this guy. Mike only left his house, he told me, for 10 minutes that morning, exactly when I came. And Hashem moved me over from Mike's house exactly where I had to go to find this guy mowing his lawn when he was outside for his exact 20 minutes and get in touch with him in order to put the finishing touches on the eruv and just finalize everything. And I just, as I'm going through these things, I'm just like, of course that happens. Like, of course Hashem moved me over right over there. I could keep going on with more and more of these stories. It's getting long. I'll finish with one final story that this was just like mind-blowing to me. So when I went to Mike's house and his wife answered the door, I told her how helpful her husband has been and that I wanted to buy him a gift as a token of appreciation. So I asked her, what does Mike like better? Is he more of a bourbon guy or more of a wine guy? So she told me Mike likes red wine. Get him a bottle of red wine. So I said, okay, great. Happy to. Then when Mike came on, I said, what does your wife like? He says, my wife likes chocolate. Perfect. A box of chocolates and a bottle of red wine. So I go into Specs, which is a very large alcoholic beverage store here in Dallas. I walk in and I say, can you direct me to the person who's the wine expert here? So they direct me to a certain fellow and I tell him, I really don't know much about wine, but I want to gift a nice bottle of red wine to a friend of mine to really help me out with something. And can you suggest me a nice bottle of red wine? And I told him my price range. Now, there must have been thousands of bottles of wine there. It's literally rows and rows from floor, 10 shelves high, each one with different bottles of wine. And he's walking up and down looking at different bottles. And eventually, after going back and forth probably like 4 or 5 times, he stops. He walks over to a certain bottle, takes it off the shelf and says, here's your bottle. And then he goes on, I actually just recently met with the winemaker of this bottle and he gives me all of the wine details that flew right over my head. I look at this bottle and my mouth drops open. On the front of the bottle is a picture of what looks like a utility pole with a wire going across it. And if that wasn't enough, I'm going to read to you from the back of the bottle. Here's what it says, and I'm reading this as a quote. I spent my childhood holidays helping my mathematical genius father, Donald Goldschmidt, setting out survey lines from trig points on the tops of hills. These locations act as constant points of reference for all property boundaries and infrastructures. I look at the wine guy and I say, you're right, this is my bottle. You found the eruv bottle. It was unbelievable. I asked the guy to pull any bottle of wine off the shelf. And after walking for 5 minutes, he pulls off a bottle of wine with a picture of an eruv and a discussion of boundaries on the back. It was unbelievable. I can share more stories, but it's getting long, so I'll end here. And I'll just tell everyone that look in your life and try to see where can I find that God is just holding my hand and helping me. Sometimes you feel it in life and it's just so clear that I just know how this conversation is going to go because Hashem has just been helping me so much. And when you start to notice it, you'll notice it more, and then you'll notice it more, and then you'll notice it more, until it becomes a natural part of your life. And I give us all a blessing that we should be able to find that in our lives. And anyone who's listening to this that has their own stories of what we call in Hebrew hashgacha pratis, which means divine providence, where we feel like Hashem is individually helping you, feel free to share them with me. I would love to hear your stories. You can always reach me at thethinkingjewpodcast@gmail.com. The eruv is officially up in Richardson this Shabbos, everyone. Wishing y'all a great Shabbos.
Thank you for listening to the Thinking Jew podcast and for taking the time to study Torah and deepen your connection to Judaism. If you found value in today's episode, please leave us a rating or review and subscribe to the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or topic requests for Rabbi Moshe, please email thethinkingjewpodcast@gmail.com or visit thethinkingjew.com.